So perhaps, Papert, would you like to start off?
Yeah, what I feel about 9/10 of what the other participants said is in a different universe from the things that seem important to me. I find myself somewhat at a loss for the first time I remember recently. But I'd like to say a few things. First of all, I'd like to put myself in the unusual position of criticizing some of the easy assumption of the achievement of artificial intelligence. And it seems to me that most of what Putnam and Mackay say assumes that we can make some kind of simulation of human experience, of human behavior, and then they are concerned with how you would reconcile that situation with certain assumptions that we are used to making about our psychological, philosophical, theological relations to ourselves and the world. It seems to me, first of all, that in that state where we had these artificial intelligences, if we had them, it would be very unlikely that the old philosophical, theological, psychological relations with ourselves would survive any more than the medieval ones survived the development of modern science and the Renaissance. However, I don't really want to go into that. Sorry I raised it. What I'd really like to take up is the one serious practical point that Putnam raised about the immediate feasibility of artificial intelligence, and that is the question of the lack of generality in AI programs. And I'd like to spell out a point or two that I think did not apparently come across from what I was saying. First of all, I certainly was not saying that AI is one thing after another. I mean, very much not. On the contrary, I said that's not the mode in which I'd like to discuss artificial intelligence. It's not a matter of an empirical observation that the programs this year are better than the programs last year. The nature of the enterprise, as I see it, has changed from that to something else. And the nature of the something else is an examination of kinds of human knowledge. What this means in relation to generality is something like this. If one thinks in terms of the brain power kind of model of intelligence, I include under that any views of the form some special property of the brain tissue is responsible for intelligence, or any view of the form that some very powerful algorithms, like some super hyper resolution principle, will be discovered, and these will cause enormously greater possibilities of deduction and drawing out of consequences of assumptions and so on, including all that in one basket, putting under brain power, and putting in the other basket the kind of approach that I was trying to call epistemological. What I'd like to focus on is what does the switching to epistemology mean in terms of generality? It's quite clear that everybody who believes in brain power thinks of that as his source of generality, and that's why he believes in brain power, that the brain power is the source of the great generality of human intelligence. You have this enormously powerful general apparatus that grinds away at the particular pieces of knowledge in order to produce the particular conclusions. If we give that up, what possibility is there to find generality? And the main theme that I'd like to suggest is, as becoming more and more dominant in thinking about AI, is a set of answers to that question. Where else could the generality come from? Now I'm going to pick on one other source of generality. If the source of generality is not in general mechanisms, it is in general ideas. And the possibility of generality of intelligence then is identical with the existence of certain very powerful ideas which, in the hands of scientists, philosophers, theologians, whoever, or children for that matter, are able to generate enormously great intellectual power. Where would we find such ideas? Well, we'd find them by examining human thinking. We'd find them, for example, by examining, say, the history of science. And we'd ask ourselves whether in the history of science we do or do not find certain principles which in the hands of the scientists have led to enormous breakthroughs in the power of science. And so we're led into the enterprise of looking at the history of science and how the scientists have operated, rather than into the nature of brain mechanisms or superlogical deductive principles. Well, what would an example be of such a powerful principle? I think I'd like to take one, and because it happens to be one that we do, I'd like to take two actually, and they happen to be getting into certain of the more recent AI programs. And one of them I'd like to take under the name of the whole really is very often the sum of the parts. And I'd like to go back to Aristotle and talk about some real thinking. By the way, I think an important slogan is that you can't think about thinking without thinking about something, and that a lot of the sterility of the psychology of thought comes from the fact that they try to think about thinking in general and not focus on thinking about something specific. Well, let's take an example, a specific problem. Let's imagine Galileo fighting with a hypothetical Aristotle, and I'm going to blur over a lot of history, and I know Benedetti and whatnot was predated Galileo, but just simplifying the story, I imagine Galileo in a dialogue with Aristotle about whether the 2-pound body and the 1-pound body, if released, will hit the ground at the same time. So Aristotle says, well, the 2-pound body moves faster and will hit the ground in half the time or whatever. Galileo says, no, they will hit the ground at the same time. Galileo's argument is, I find most people don't know this, and I'm horrified, but I think that's an important thing about education rather than about artificial intelligence. Galileo's argument goes like this. He says, if you've got a 2-pound body, let's imagine that you sliced it by or let's imagine that you had 2 separate 1-pound bodies, and you dropped those. Would they take the same time to reach the ground as a single 1-pound body? And we have to imagine that Aristotle, I think I've never heard it suggest that Aristotle would not assent to that. Just by a sort of obvious symmetry, the 2 separate 1-pound bodies would fall to the ground in the same time as the single 1-pound body. Then says Galileo, since they're falling together, if you were to stretch a gossamer thread between them, wouldn't they then? So Aristotle might say, oh no, but the gossamer thread might break because there's interactions. And Galileo would point out, no, they wouldn't break, because since they are falling at the same rate, there is no interaction. And so on. You spell out the argument, and what it really boils down to is that Galileo has discovered an enormously powerful principle. The enormously powerful principle says you can think of the 2-pound body as 2 separate 1-pound bodies. You can sometimes think of the whole as the sum of the parts. Now, I think it's almost true that almost everywhere in physics, in mechanics anyway, where a problem has succumbed to analysis, it has succumbed first by, in some sense, being approximated by one of those splitting of a complex system into simple systems. This is the principle of linearity, and it's not always true, of course. You often have to correct it afterwards by watching out for interactions, and sometimes you see the interactions are so bad that the correction undoes the whole thing. But it is a powerful strategy in physics that you can sometimes split the problem and think of the whole as the sum of the parts. An anti-psychology crack that's probably unfair is that maybe one of the reasons why psychology is so unsuccessful and physics so successful is not that the subject matter is harder, but that psychologists have got into the habit of prefacing their books with these dire warnings against the principle that against the idea that you can take the whole as the sum of its parts. And there's hardly a psychology textbook that doesn't warn you against that. There's hardly a physicist who doesn't encourage his students to do just that on every possible occasion. Well, I think that is an example of a very powerful principle. Now, can we put such very powerful principles into programs? And you already saw one example of yes. In a very simple way, the example that I had this afternoon of the scene analysis, where you take the two blocks and break them apart, is a very simple example of a program which in its first version did not explicitly know this principle. The principle was merely embedded in it. But the development of such programs has taken the form of making this principle explicit to a greater and greater extent. Now, to say just how goes into technical detail, but that wasn't my purpose here. My purpose is to point to a direction. Where do we look towards for a source of generality? And I'm saying that the epistemological approach to AI obliges us to look somewhere else than to general mechanisms, and also tells us where to look in the form of such powerful principles. And now, if we looked, for example, at the case quoted by Putnam of the arithmetic program to prove if you take, in fact, any theorem-proving program in the classical sense, it's very clear that they are highly deficient in not having any general ideas. And you take this program and you give it 4 axioms of a group, but you don't even tell it that they're 4 axioms of a group. You don't give it any knowledge about groups in general, or algebraic structures in general, or mathematical principles in general. And hence, of course, they're highly particular. To hope that they would do anything is to succumb to the superhuman human fallacy, since no person would be able to deduce anything under those conditions. And I don't see how, in any sense, it's intrinsic to the idea of theorem-proving programs that you should stack the cards against your poor program by giving it so little knowledge to go to and so little access to these powerful principles. So this is not to say that it's been done very much, and the identification of such principles is programmatic, and but it's a direction. So maybe I should stop there. Can I just end by ending on the same little quote, the same little other example that I ended on this afternoon, that when we try to apply this idea to education, we do exactly the same thing. That is, in teaching children to think about physics, we try to isolate these powerful principles which exist in a qualitative form in the thinking of the physicist, but are never written down in the formal discourse of the physicist. And generally speaking, the education in science and mathematics of children, and maybe in other areas too, errs in exactly the same way as the making of theorem-proving programs of the highly formalized logical sort. Namely, you only talk to the children about the formalized mode of discourse of a symbolism that has no heuristic power in it and is not able to function, which does not have any representation of the